Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a world where ships groan against the current sails, snap in the salty wind, and the promise of bread can make or break an empire. Imagine the harbour of Alexandria at dusk gulls, wheel above masts like restless ghosts. The smell of fish mixes with the sweeter scent of crushed grain, and thousands of sacks wait to be loaded onto ships that will cross the Mediterranean. The air is sticky, the mood is anxious because every man knows that Rome's stomach is as vast as its empire. You probably wouldn't survive long if you were in charge of feeding 1 million people without enough ships, but the Romans gave it a heroic shot. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and while you're at it, let me know your location, and the local time where you're listening. I love seeing our little community stretch across continents and time zones. Now find yourself a cosy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins with Alexandria, Egypt's great port, and one of the most dazzling jewels in Rome's imperial crown. By the 1st century, the city is not just a place of scholarship and towering libraries, it is the empire's breadbasket. The Nile's predictable floods turn Egyptian soil into one of the most fertile regions in the ancient world. Fields of wheat stretch toward the horizon, harvested with curved sickles bundled in sheaves and hauled by donkeys to granaries that smell of dust and abundance. Here lies the mainstream fact historians estimate that as much as 1/3 of Rome's annual grain supply comes from Egypt. Without this constant flow of bread, the Roman capital would starve, and when Romans starve, emperors do not last long on their thrones. Now picture the grain fleet itself. Dozens upon dozens of merchant vessels, their hulls tarred dark, their sails stitched with heavy linen lie in the harbour like patient beasts waiting to be unleashed. Each ship carries thousands of amphorae filled not with wine or oil this time, but with carefully stored grain. Soldiers patrol the docks, scribes scratch tallies onto wax tablets, and overseers shout over the clatter of rigging. A quirky tidbit whispers through the sources some captains would sprinkle gypsum powder over the grain to keep it dry during the crossing, which made for crunchy bread once it reached Rome. Imagine biting into that loaf. No one ever said empire tasted glamorous. The voyage from Alexandria to Ostia, Rome's main port, is long but usually straightforward, provided the winds cooperate. With fair weather, the journey might take 2 weeks. With storms, it might stretch into 2 months. The ships sail northward along the Levantine coast before striking west across the Mediterranean, the horizon often empty except for dolphins leaping in grey arcs. Sailors hum songs to pass the hours, sometimes spitting into the sea for luck. They know the waters can be treacherous. A storm rising from nowhere can snap a mast-shredder sail, or scatter the convoy into lonely fragments. Historians still argue whether the Romans mastered the art of predicting Mediterranean weather, or whether they simply relied on faith prayers and perhaps a bribe or two to Neptune. On board, life is cramped and loud. Grain takes up every corner, stacked in bags that smell faintly sweet and dusty, crawling with mice no one can quite eliminate. Sailors sleep on narrow planks, cursing when grain dust makes their throats raw. They eat flatbread baked on small braziers, their fingers greasy from oil and salted fish. To pass the time, they carve crude dice from bone or scratch names into the wood of the deck. One fringe tidbit comes from a late Roman anecdote: sailors would sometimes toss coins into the sea. When departing Alexandria, not for luck, but as a symbolic payment to the river gods of the Nile, asking them not to chase the ships into open water. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the people wait. Bread is not merely food, it is politics, a bribe baked into daily life. The grain dole free or subsidised grain distributed to citizens keeps the restless population calm. Picture the forum at midday. Citizens in russet and saffron tunics line up for their rations, chatting about gladiator matches or the latest scandal in the Senate. A rumour that the fleet is late spreads like wildfire, making tempers as brittle as stale crusts. Politicians watch nervously because every empty stomach is a spark, and Rome has always been a city quick to ignite. The mystery of the vanished fleet begins with such whispers. One year, historians are maddeningly vague on the exact date Rome expects the convoy from Egypt, but the ships never arrive. Not one vessel limps into Ostia. No grain fills the storehouses. The Tiber's quays remain strangely quiet, the usual clatter of unloading amphorae replaced by anxious silence. The Empire has faced storms, pirates and uprisings before, but for an entire fleet to vanish, that is something else entirely. As days turn into weeks, the mood in Rome sours. Bakers complain of dwindling supplies, charging higher prices for smaller loaves. Citizens grumble, voices rising in the Subura, that crowded maze of insulae where gossip grows faster than mould on damp bread. Officials scramble for explanations, perhaps storms scattered the ships. Perhaps pirates grew bold and struck the convoy. Or perhaps the grain still sits in Alexandria, never launched at all. Historians still argue whether the silence in the records is evidence of embarrassment, suppression, or simple ignorance. One can imagine the conversations. In a smoky tavern near the Forum, a labourer mutters, "The Emperor must be cursed, why else would Neptune steal his bread?" A companion replies, "Forget Neptune. I hear the Egyptians kept the grain themselves. They're fattening on our hunger." Across town, a senator smooths his toga and whispers to a colleague, "If the people riot, it will not be the gods they blame. It will be us. Every lost amphora is political dynamite, every rumour a spark. Through it all, the Danube frontier still bristles, legions still march temples, still burn incense, but the heart of Rome feels hollow without its bread. The mystery of the vanished fleet lingers like an unbaked loaf, heavy and unfinished. Was it swallowed by storms, seized by enemies, or simply hidden in the shadows of imperial politics? No one yet knows, and that not knowing becomes the haunting refrain of this story. The voyage begins where the Nile itself exhales into the sea, a wide, silt-laden delta brimming with papyrus reeds, fishing boats, and the bustle of Alexandria's harbours. Here at the edge of Africa, Rome's stomach finds its main supplier. Egypt is the empire's breadbasket, sending ship after ship loaded with grain across the Mediterranean to feed the capital's endlessly hungry population. The math is sobering. In some years over 200,000 tons of grain move northward enough to keep millions of Romans in bread, that staple of life, without which riots ignite faster than torches in dry straw. Bread may sound humble, but it is political dynamite. Lose the grain, and you risk losing the city. So each sailing season begins with hope routine and just a pinch of dread, because the sea is as fickle as emperors, and not even Roman logistics can control the waves. Picture the docks, towering stone quays, cranes creaking, as ropes strain longshoremen shouting in accents from every corner of the empire. The ships themselves are vast by ancient standards, hulking vessels with hulls made from thick cedar planks, fastened by iron nails and oaken pegs. Their bellies yawn open for amphorae and sacks, each amphora designed to hold about 20 litres, roughly 5 gallons of oil or wine, while sacks of barley and wheat are stacked by the hundreds, their weight pressing down like a stone deity. Soldiers oversee the process, checking seals, counting crates, ensuring no thief filches a loaf before it leaves the delta. One mainstream fact makes this scene vivid. The Annona Rome's official grain supply system is meticulously managed by a corps of officials who treat paperwork like sacred scripture. Without these ledgers, chaos would reign, and the bakeries of Rome would go silent. But chaos does not need much encouragement to slip in. Whispers curl among the sailors that year, rumours about strange omens. One man swears he saw a heron perched on the mast staring inland, an ill sign in seafaring lore. Another points to the sudden appearance of jellyfish in the shallows, glowing faintly under moonlight as if the sea were boiling with hidden fire. Sailors notoriously superstitious take these as warnings, and you cannot entirely blame them. When your life depends on a vessel of wood held together by tar prayers, become part of the rigging. They mutter charms, tie small amulets to ropes, and pour a splash of wine into the surf as insurance against Poseidon's mood swings. The officers roll their eyes, but even the sternest among them may pocket a charm when no one is looking. Historians still argue whether the grain fleets launched that season faced unusual storms, or whether something subtler was at play. Ancient records are ambiguous. A few notes about delayed arrivals, a mention of shortages in Rome, but no detailed logs of disasters. Some scholars suggest the records were deliberately vague, a bureaucratic way of hiding failure under phrases like losses in transport. Others believe the problem lay not with the sea, but with human greed, pirates prowling the waters, governors siphoning off supplies, or merchants diverting grain to sell at inflated prices in famine-struck provinces. It is tantalizing to imagine crates of Egyptian wheat being offloaded not in Rome, but in some hidden cove exchanged for silver under moonlight. And oh, those pirates! The Mediterranean may be Rome's mare nostrum, our sea, but even the proudest empire cannot patrol every wave. Along the coasts of Crete, Cilicia, and beyond, small, swift ships wait like wolves for the lumbering grain carriers. These pirate vessels narrow and fast strike without warning their oars, cutting water like knives, their crews shouting in languages that Roman centurions cannot understand but recognize well enough the sound of trouble. The grain carriers are fat, slow, and tempting like buffet tables floating across the sea. Naval escorts sometimes accompany them, but resources are thin, and pirates know when to wait, when to strike, and when to melt into hidden coves before the imperial triremes can give chase. As the fleet departs, Alexandria sails bloom like a field of linen flowers against the horizon, catching the northerly winds. The air smells of salt tar and grain dust, a scent that clings to every tunic and sandal. Sailors sing work songs to keep rhythm as they row their voices carrying across the water in overlapping cadences. Somewhere below deck, rats already nibble at a corner of the cargo, oblivious to imperial decrees. The captain, a leathery man with eyes narrowed from years, squinting into sunlit waves, mutters to his helmsman about current sandbanks and the eternal dance of wind and water. He knows the voyage is long, and he knows that Rome waits with open hands and empty stomachs. Quirky tidbits pepper the preparations. One chronicler mentions that sailors sometimes smeared pitch, mixed with garlic along the seams of the hull, claiming it kept seaworms at bay. Whether this worked, or simply made the ships smell like floating kitchens, is unclear, but it reflects the blend of science, superstition, and desperation that marked ancient seafaring. Another tale insists that a captain once sacrificed a loaf of bread before departure, tossing it into the surf only to watch it sink like a stone. The sailors groaned, certain doom awaited. Ironically, that voyage made it safely, while the next year's fleet with no such ritual faced tragedy. The horizon stretches, promising both opportunity and risk. The grain fleet pushes westward along the Mediterranean coast, its progress measured by the rise and fall of familiar landmarks, the jagged cliffs near Cyrenaica, the sheltered harbours of Crete, the endless expanse of sea that seems to breathe with its own pulse. The men aboard grow accustomed to the rhythm days of steady progress, nights of torchlight flickering on deck, the creak and groan of timbers, like a lullaby for sailors who pretend not to fear what lies below. Every wave whispers possibility, safe arrival, disaster, or something stranger still. The fleet sails on, watched by gulls, shadowed by clouds, accompanied by the constant mutter of water against wood. Rome waits its people queuing outside bakeries, its officials sharpening quills over parchment. Bread is life, and life depends on these ships. Yet somewhere between Alexandria and the Tiber the story falters. Supplies vanish, ships fail to appear, and the silence that follows tastes heavier than famine. Was it storm sabotage or theft? The answer remains hidden, wrapped in waves and whispers. But the journey has only begun, and the mystery deepens with every nautical mile. Storms haunt the Mediterranean like uninvited guests at a banquet, never announcing when they will arrive, never caring who they inconvenience, and rarely leaving without demanding a toll. The vanished grain fleet may have been vast hundreds of ships with sails stretched wide, but even the largest fleet is still a collection of fragile wooden hulls, riding the back of an unpredictable sea. Tonight, picture the scene, the convoy slipping westward from Crete or Rhodes, sunlight glittering on its curved sails when the horizon darkens with an unsettling quickness. The air thickens, the first raindrops slap like thrown pebbles, and the Mediterranean begins to show its teeth. Mainstream history tells us that the Roman grain fleets were not small nervous ventures, but massive, almost industrial convoys. By the 1st century, emperors depended on them so completely that grain distribution became state-sponsored, guarded as carefully as the emperor's own person. Rome at its peak consumed roughly 150,000 tons of Egyptian grain per year, an impossible figure without colossal shipping operations. But even the best plans have one eternal enemy: the weather. Sailors knew it well, muttering that Neptune himself never signed Rome's contracts. Waves rose higher than a man. Ships creaked like wicker baskets, straining under too much weight. The sailors hauled ropes rough as iron fire tongs, pulled the sails down in desperate bundles, and lashed amphorae tighter with ropes that bit into their hands. Picture the clamour wind howling like a pack of wolves, timbers groaning, men shouting in Greek, Latin and Egyptian, all at once, none of it loud enough to compete with the storm. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a cook clutches a wicker basket of onions, because sometimes absurdity survives even in catastrophe. That image of someone protecting his onions while the sea threatened to devour him has a strange truth. Human beings cling to small comforts when larger ones slip away. Historians still argue whether a single massive storm could account for the disappearance of an entire convoy. Some argue the Mediterranean has a long memory of swallowing fleets. The famous naval battle at Actium may have been fought on calmer waters, but countless campaigns before and after were disrupted by sudden tempests. Others doubt it. How could so many ships vanish without any survivors limping to shore with their stories? Could Neptune really silence every voice? The lack of records makes the puzzle sharper, not softer. Quirky traditions surround sailors and storms. Ancient mariners often carried small charms like carved dolphins, or jars of salt meant to teach the sea to behave. Roman sources even describe sailors sacrificing roosters before voyagers, a practical bird for predicting weather, but also a convenient dinner should the voyage go smoothly. Imagine a sailor on the grain fleet muttering at his rooster, "Well, if we drown, at least you're not getting eaten." Humour always finds a way to sneak through. As waves tower, sails shred, and masts snap like dry twigs, the possibility looms that the entire fleet did not vanish in a single violent gulp, but scattered into fragments across hundreds of miles. Perhaps some ships were hurled against rocky coasts in Sicily, their remains buried under centuries of silt. Others may have sunk intact into deeper waters, where mud quickly sealed amphory timber and bronze fittings in cold silence. Amphora shards washing up on beaches would have been noted by locals, but locals do not always write histories. The absence in Roman records remains heavier than the sea itself. Rome did have methods for bracing against weather. Convoys often hugged coasts rather than daring the open sea, even if it meant slower voyages. They sometimes carried extra sails and ropes, and captains hired pilots who claimed to know friendly winds. Yet no shipwright of antiquity could fully conquer the Mediterranean's moods. When gales rose from the Libyan coast, they pushed walls of water northward, battering the very trade routes Rome depended on. A single bad season could send ripples of hunger from Alexandria to the Forum. Some scholars wonder if the silent vanishing of this grain fleet reflects not the sea's cruelty, but the empire's embarrassment. Recording that a storm devoured supplies might sound dangerously like admitting that Rome's gods were displeased, or that an emperor failed to secure Neptune's favour. Better to let the records grow vague, to chalk up missing grain to losses at sea without detail. After all, bureaucrats in Rome were experts at smoothing unpleasant wrinkles from the empire's toga, but folklore has no such restraint. Later sailors along the Sicilian coast told stories of ghostly ships, seen in moonlight sails glowing faintly, as though lit from within, vanishing as dawn broke. Fishermen claimed to hear faint rattling of amphorae under their hulls, as if cargo still shifted on sunken decks. Skeptics called it nonsense, yet such tales cling like barnacles. It is easier to explain hunger if one can say the ships are not lost only sailing forever out of reach. Picture the survivors if there were any crawling onto shore. Salt stiffens their russet tunics, the fabric clinging like parchment to their limbs. They spit mud, drag themselves from the surf, and look around for other survivors who never appear. One might even mutter a joke through cracked lips. At least the crocodile dung sunscreen washed off. Because when you lose everything, humour is the last shield left, so was it storm sabotage or silence. The Mediterranean remains a restless partner, always reminding empires that geography, not politics, writes the last word. The vanished grain fleet may have foundered in one terrible night, when nature showed Rome that even an empire cannot bully the sea, or it may have slipped away piecemeal, one ship here, another there, until the convoy was simply gone. Either way, the hunger that followed was real, and the whispers that filled the silence carried further than any wave. Pirates are the Mediterranean's unofficial tax collectors, collecting dues whether empires approve or not. And tonight they shadow the convoy like lean wolves trotting beside a caravan. The vanished Egyptian grain fleet, heavy with sacks and amphory sails, like a floating marketplace. Every creak of timber is a promise of profit to someone hiding in a rocky cove. The ships move in file oars, clicking, rigging, humming, and for every helmsman reading the stars, there is another set of eyes on shore reading opportunity. Rome calls the sea mare nostrum our sea, but anyone who actually rows across it knows the water belongs to whoever shows up fastest with the sharpest hooks. One mainstream fact ties this fear to the map, even after Pompey's vaunted campaign against Cilician piracy in the 1st century. Before the Common Era, when he famously sweeps the sea in a matter of months, piracy does not vanish. It mutates. Under Augustus and later emperors, patrols at Misenum and Ravenna try to keep lanes open, yet the coastline is long, the coves are labyrinths, and small crews in light hulls still slip between the teeth of Roman control. A grain fleet is everything pirates like, slow, predictable, and stuffed with cargo that can be sold in any hungry port. Night folds down like a lid. The convoy hugs a coast where cliffs lean over water, and pine resin scents the air. A lookout points there, a faint smear of sail where no escort should be. another lower like a gull's wing. Then more. The pirate boats appear as if thumbed from the dark by an impatient god. They are narrow yolk yellow and indigo patches quilted across their sails, oars beating a quick pulse. They do not look impressive, they look inevitable. The first strike is not a crash of rams, but a whisper of grapnels passing from hand to hand, iron biting wet wood. Hooks catch. Lines snap taut. Men who live by speed now turn to leverage. They pore over the rails with knives and short spears barefoot for grip hair salted white by sun and spray. Grain carriers answer with poles and belaying pins anything close to hand. Someone upends a wicker basket of onions to make space to swing. Someone else, hilariously faithful to his last assignment, keeps shouting the tally of sacks even as the tally becomes a prayer. Grain bursts from a slashed bag and sleets across the deck, in a golden rain turning planks into marbles. Feet fly, bodies skid, dignity resigns. A pirate slips collides with a jar of garum and the night erupts in the smell of fermented fish, a defence system no admiral ever planned. Light joke one somewhere, a captain mutters that, if the pirates do not retreat from the swords, they may retreat from the breath. Quirky tidbits drift through ancient gossip like corked bottles. Some crews the stories insist fancy themselves impresarios and force captives to recite verses or dance for their freedom. One captain reputedly demands payment not in gold but in amphorae of sauce for a banquet. Another, more practical, takes only nails and rope piracy runs on hardware as much as hunger. Whether these details are embroidered or earnest hardly matters on a night like this. Fear listens to any story that explains itself. The clash is not a single battle, but a fray stretched along miles of dark water. Here a grain ship shakes free and rows hard for a headland. There a smaller freighter coughs out her cargo to ride higher sacks hitting the sea with soft thuds bursting into pale clouds, that the current flattens like flour on a table. A fast boat rakes across the convoy's wake, its oarsmen driving at perhaps 9 to 11 kilometers per hour, about 6 to 7 miles per hour in short, murderous sprints just quick enough to nip at the flanks of anything that falls behind. The bulk carriers 30 to 40 meters long, about 98 to 131 feet, can make better speed with perfect wind, but storms have been sulking at the horizon for days, and tonight the air sits heavy and unhelpful. Historians still argue whether such raiding, even multiplied, could erase a fleet so completely that Rome receives neither hull nor rumour with a clean return address. Skeptics say piracy explains missing cargo, not a citywide famine. Optimists for the pirate theory point to the invisible circuits of black markets, where wheat, unlike jewels, does not sit in vaults but disappears by the mouthful. If they say diverted ships unload in 5 different coves, sail under new names and sell into provincial towns at swollen prices, the effect in Rome looks like vanishing without a splash. Inside the empire, profiteers smell profit the way sharks smell blood. Shortage in Rome means prices spike in Rome. Abundance anywhere else becomes a silent goldmine. Picture a merchant with a neat beard and neater conscience arranging for escorts to misread the wind. He does not need a cutlass. He needs a warehouse. Inwardly, he calculates 20 litres per amphora, about 5 gallons, tens of thousands of amphorae. What is that in denarii if the forum's bakeries go dark for a fortnight? Outwardly, he shrugs and blames the sea. If questioned, he produces scrolls laced with phrases like losses at sea and reallocation in transit's smooth language that turns theft into weather. On water, where math becomes muscle, sailors live moment to moment. One ship's crew throws spare spars across the gap to jam pirate oars. Another slashes rope ladders and prees off grapnels with iron fire tongs borrowed from the galley. A helmsman orders the sail braced to edge for shallows where a narrow-drafted raider might ground. Orders snap in Latin answers come in Greek, and a curse in Egyptian hangs comically in the air halfway between blasphemy and poetry. Light joke too, a cabin boy, remembering our earlier traveller's crocodile dung sunscreen, smears pitch on his cheeks and swears it makes him invisible. His mate replies that the smell makes him unforgettable. Some encounters a quiet cruelty. A pirate boat cuts free a single freighter at the convoy's tail, shearing the lines that keep her in formation. Separated, she sails like a house without neighbours, too slow to sprint, too proud to beg. By morning there is no mourning for her as a Roman ship. She has a new name, new captain, and a destiny to bob politely into an anonymous creek, where grain turns into coins and coins into loyalties that will not be itemised. Rome, far off and famished, reads the sea by bakery windows. When loaves shrink and lines lengthen, senators begin to speak in the future, passive measures will be undertaken. Security will be enhanced, culprits will be identified. The city's humour fights back. Hawkers shout that their flatbread is pre-chewed by Neptune because it is so thin. Meanwhile, in a seaside tavern 200 leagues away, a man raises a cup and toasts the best porridge he ever ate. Like Joke 3, he wonders aloud whether pirates can file expense reports. His table laughs and thumps the boards like a crew hammering a hull. Evidence. The Mediterranean is an artist of erasure. Amphora shards wash ashore, but who notes which crest they rode? A farmer mends a wall with a Roman jar handle and cannot say whether it carried oil from Africa or wheat from Egypt. A child plays at the pier with a plundered seal stamp dropped by a careless clerk and invents a game whose rules do not include provenance. The past here hides in plain sight and refuses to sign its name, and yet hints survive in ledgers that twitch when prices due. A softness in costs along one provincial coast, the very month the forum goes sharp and brittle. A glut in a market 200 kilometres away, about 124 miles where no glut belongs. A governor's sudden generosity to a temple after a favourable wind. Patterns look suspicious only when someone bothers to connect them, and the men most qualified to connect them often enjoy the patterns too much to complain. By dawn, after a bad night, the surviving convoy, if there is one, creeps onward, lighter by a dozen holds and heavier by silence. Captains count crews and find gaps they cannot close. Sailors sweep grain from decks and dump it in scoops into the greedy sea, murmuring that at least some Roman mouths will be fed by fish. A gull lands on the yard and cries like a laughter that forgot how to be kind. Somewhere behind them, in alcoves scratched into stone amphorae, stand in tidy pyramids, promising bread to a town that does not need it, while Rome mutters hunger into its sleeve. Pirates do not crown themselves kings of the sea. They crown themselves accountants of other men's risk. The vanished fleet may not rest in one watery grave, but in a ledger spread across a dozen hidden harbours, each line item a ship renamed a cargo, redistributed a profit taken in quiet rooms that smell of brine and lamp oil. Whether knives or quills do the greater harm is a question the sea refuses to answer. Rome waits at the mouth of the Tiber and listens for sails that never wrinkle the horizon, and the silence that drifts upriver tastes suspiciously of stolen bread. Politics in Rome is a sport where the scoreboard is hidden, and sometimes the game ends before anyone admits it has begun. The vanished grain fleet may not have been swallowed by storms or pirates at all, but lost to deliberate sabotage, a move in the eternal chess match of emperors and rivals. Grain was not simply food, it was leverage. Whoever controlled its flow controlled the heartbeat of Rome. To starve the capital even briefly was to make an emperor sweat senators panic and mobs roar, and in that uproar opportunity often sprouted like weeds between stones. A mainstream fact to anchor this suspicion: the grain dole, the monthly ration of bread for hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens, was the foundation of urban peace. The annona, as it was called, became state policy by the late Republic, and remained sacrosanct throughout the empire. Augustus himself boasted of securing the grain supply. Later emperors built monumental harbours like Trajan's hexagonal port at Portus, just to ensure smoother deliveries. Bread was not luxury, it was stability, which makes the sudden disappearance of an Egyptian fleet not only a maritime tragedy, but a political earthquake. Imagine the Senate chamber during a shortage. White togas flutter in the draft, voices rise like gulls fighting over scraps, and fingers point in every direction but inward. Was it pirates, one asks? Was it storms, another demands? Yet beneath the noise simmers a darker possibility: someone wanted the fleet to vanish. Perhaps a rival faction in Alexandria ensured the ships left undercrewed. Perhaps a governor on the African coast redirected them under secret orders. Perhaps a courtier whispered in an admiral's ear that a storm looked worse than it really was. Rome thrives on rumour, and rumour thrives when bellies are empty. Sabotage in antiquity could be subtle. A single delay in loading a rope cut just shy of snapping a crew bribe to take a less secure channel, all might tip fate's hand. Historians still argue whether bureaucrats complicit in such sabotage would dare leave traces, or whether their silence in the records is proof enough of their crime. Some suggest famine itself became a weapon wielded in power struggles. Julius Caesar once reminded the people that grain was his gift. Later emperors feared that mobs in the forum deprived of bread might chant for regime change as loudly as for gladiators. Consider the possibility of calculated delay. An ambitious governor in Egypt, eager to see the emperor weakened, could have stalled the convoy until the Nile's floods left harbours treacherous. When the ships finally sailed, it was too late to guarantee safe passage. a clever plot wrapped in the excuse of nature. Who can blame an official for bad weather? The gods themselves, after all, play dice with storms. Like Joke 1, if Roman officials were as skilled at seamanship as they were at excuses, the empire might have lasted forever. Quirky stories do surface in later texts. One legend insists that a prefect of Egypt secretly sold part of the grain fleet's cargo to Syrian merchants, pocketing fortunes while Rome hungered. Another tale, less credible but more colourful, claims an emperor's mistress engineered the delay simply to humiliate her rival in the palace. Whether true or not, such gossip shows how people believed sabotage was always lurking behind shortages. Rome, after all, never met a disaster it could not reframe as someone else's plot. The psychology of sabotage is as revealing as its mechanics. To starve the city was to send a message: the emperor cannot feed you, perhaps another man can. In a world where loyalty was as fragile as papyrus, that whisper carried sharp edges. Armies might remain loyal on the frontier, but in the capital it was the crowd's hunger that toppled regimes. A ruler could win a war in Dacia and still fall if bakers' shelves lay bare. Historians still argue whether emperors themselves might have been complicit engineering scarcity to punish the populace or rivals. Could a ruler deliberately withhold ships to prove his indispensability later? The idea feels almost too cynical, yet Rome's history provides examples. Domitian once cut distributions to fund his armies. Others taxed grain heavily, knowing it sparked unrest, then swooped in as saviours. Control the hunger, control the people. Picture a scene at Porter's Long Quays, stretching cranes, idle crowds gathering with baskets and wicker sacks. Word spreads, no ships. The people mutter, then shout, then shove. A magistrate tries to calm them, citing storms, but someone hurls a clay cup and soon stones fly. The riot spills toward the forum. Senators retreat into their porticos while graffiti blooms on walls overnight. The emperor starves us. In that tense silence, one faction sharpens daggers of rhetoric. Another sharpens real daggers. Like Joke 2, imagine the unlucky official tasked with announcing the shortage. He climbs the rostrum, clears his throat, and is instantly pelted with stale bread. Rome had a way of expressing dissatisfaction without waiting for the debate to end. Sabotage also fit the pattern of Roman intrigue, where poison in the cup or forged letters in the archives were as common as open battle. If entire legions could be betrayed by a conniving general, why not fleets by conniving merchants or governors? The Mediterranean was wide and oversight from Rome was slow. A fleet delayed or redirected might vanish long before accountability caught up. And accountability, when it finally arrived, often took the form of exile, confiscation, or a carefully worded suicide note. Folklore later embroidered these suspicions. Some said the fleet was lured into a false harbour, lit by decoy fires, ships dashed on reefs, while rivals toasted their downfall inland. Others whispered that bribes bought silence from coastal sentries who saw too much. A few even claimed the fleet reached Italy but was diverted up a hidden river mouth, its cargo feeding rebel armies instead of Roman mouths. Stories contradict, but they all share one root: people believed the loss was not chance but choice. Like Joke 3, a satirist once quipped that if the gods wanted to sabotage Rome, they wouldn't need storms, they'd simply appoint another human official. The laugh might be weary, but it was also sharp. So was sabotage the culprit. The truth hides behind layers of motive and opportunity. Ships vanish, grain fails to arrive, riots swell, and emperors shift uneasily on their thrones. Whether it was the sea's fury, pirates' greed, or politicians' plots, the outcome was the same: Rome starved while whispers fed on the silence. As the narrative flows on, the mood shifts toward the delicate balance between Roman dependence and Roman neglect. By now, the grain fleet is supposed to be approaching Italian shores, its hold stacked high with Egyptian harvests, wheat baked in desert sun barley cut from the lush floodplains after the Nile's annual gift of silt, and amphorae of lentils and beans to round out rations. The expectation in Rome is not simply hopeful, it is foundational. Without those supplies, the bread dole wobbles like a three-legged stool on uneven cobblestones. People begin to count the days their patience as fragile as pottery each morning, bringing sharper mutters in the forum about delays. The fleet's absence feels like a missing heartbeat in the empire's body, and everyone senses the pause. Merchants, of course, are not patient souls. Grain dealers see their ledgers falter, and bakers once generous with loaves suddenly slice them thinner. Families accustomed to bread as their staple begin to worry because bread is more than food. It is a guarantee that Rome still functions. A mainstream historical fact holds true here. The The annona or state grain supply fed hundreds of thousands of citizens in the capital, and emperors staked their legitimacy on keeping bellies full. Historians still argue whether any emperor ever truly secured the supply lines, or whether they simply postponed collapse with endless shipments. Either way, when the Nile's harvest is missing in action, rumours in Rome multiply faster than flies in a summer tavern. One rumour insists that the fleet has already docked, but corrupt officials sold the cargo elsewhere for profit. Another whispers that pirates, those opportunistic entrepreneurs of the sea, swooped in off Crete or Cyrene to scatter the ships like gulls chasing crumbs. And still another suggests divine punishment, that Ceres, goddess of grain, has turned her back because temples went uncleaned, or sacrifices were skimped. In markets, women gossip while measuring beans, and men shake heads over amphorae of watered wine, each convinced they know the real reason bread has gone scarce. Meanwhile, officials draft carefully worded statements. They prefer bland phrases like seasonal delays or weather disruptions, the kind of language bureaucrats have always used when they want to avoid blame. It is not so different from a modern office email that says we're experiencing slight delays, which usually translates to, we have no idea where your package went. A light joke, yes, but accurate. Even emperors could not make missing ships suddenly appear. Senators nod gravely, pretending reassurance, though many of them have personal warehouses of grain safely locked away. The poor, of course, cannot afford such luxuries. Quirky tales attach themselves to this gap. One story claims a baker mixed sawdust into his bread to stretch dwindling flour supplies, only to discover customers strangely praised the crunch, at least until their teeth complained. Another tale mutters that a fortune teller near the Circus Maximus predicted famine and demanded coins to reveal who would starve first. Street urchins repeated her words with glee, earning copper pieces by frightening gullible passers-by. These oddities, while not verifiable, capture the mood, nervous, half-serious and tinged with gallows humour. Historians still argue whether the missing fleet represents a single catastrophic event or simply the normal chaos of Roman logistics amplified by rumour. After all, the Mediterranean is not a tidy highway. Storms, contrary winds and poor navigation could strand ships for weeks. But the silence surrounding this particular fleet is too perfect, too clean, as though the sea itself conspired to erase the evidence. Unlike other disasters where wreckage survivors, or at least scribbled complaints, turn up, this one leaves little but speculation. The missing ships become a mirror for Roman anxieties. To the wealthy, it is a reminder that fortunes can vanish on the tide. To the poor, it is proof that emperors do not care enough to keep bread ovens burning. To soldiers stationed along frontiers, it is another story of imperial incompetence to mutter about in campfires, much like the soldier in Egypt who once boasted he could balance 3 amphorae on his head while singing bawdy songs. Yes, it ended with a predictable splash, but the tale lives on. Rome thrives on gossip, and the missing fleet becomes the biggest gossip of the decade. The situation sharpens further when officials attempt distraction. Festivals are scheduled, games are extended, gladiators fight longer bouts to keep the crowds cheering. But even entertainment cannot fill an empty stomach. Citizens begin to note the irony of lavish spectacles paired with thin rations. Bread and circuses, after all, work only if you have both. Without bread, the circus looks more like mockery. A few graffiti scrawled on city walls complain bitterly one line, allegedly reading Panem number circus, yes, hunger always. Whether genuine or invented by later commentators, such graffiti embodies the frustration. Meanwhile, sailors who have not vanished still ply the Mediterranean. They tell tales of ghostly lights seen off Alexandria, of fleets that vanish into sudden fogs of a sea that sometimes decides it wants more than its usual share of tribute. Sailors are superstitious by profession, so every missing fleet becomes evidence of some curse, some omen, some watery god frowning. A quirky tidbit claims that Neptune himself was seen rising in the foam, scooping ships into his hands like toys. Hardly credible, but in taverns after 3 cups of wine, even the sober nod solemnly. As the days stretch, the absence becomes less about grain and more about what the silence represents. If a fleet this vital can vanish without explanation, what else might Rome lose? Its armies, its emperors, its sense of invincibility. Silence is unsettling because it leaves room for imagination, and imagination unchecked always paints darker pictures than reality. Citizens whisper at night that perhaps the fleet never existed at all, that it was a phantom promise designed to soothe the restless populace. Others insist the fleet will return tomorrow loaded with abundance, but tomorrow always arrives empty. And so Rome waits, baker's ration, families stretch meals, merchants hedge bets, officials dodge questions, and the river of rumour flows stronger than the Nile itself. The grain fleet is missing, but its ghost sails everywhere in conversations, in anxious glances at granaries, in the hollow stomachs of the poor. Its absence has become a presence shaping behaviour, stirring fears and feeding legends that will outlast the grain itself. They run out of practical explanations before they run out of whispers, and when the ledgers stop speaking, the city remembers how to pray. The vanished fleet slips from account books into incense from harbourmaster math, into candlelit stories, and Rome rediscovers the old habit of blaming skies and spirits when ships do not come. People murmur that the sea is offended and the river is sulking, that a god with cold hands has pinched the sails shut and hidden the wake. The rumour spreads softly like smoke under a door. The fleet is not lost. It is kept. A mainstream fact steadies the scene. Even as it turns strange, the Romans take omens seriously. When prodigies pile up, eclipses, lightning odd births, statues sweating, magistrates consult the Sibylline books, and order rites meant to untie whatever knot the gods have tied. They hold public supplications processions that slide through streets like slow rivers and lay out couches for the gods in a lectisternium, inviting divine guests to dine, while the people stand outside and hope to be noticed. In a season of empty bakeries they do both, and then they do more. Priests mark a chalk line on the forum stones. Flutes cry. Children hold baskets of laurel and salt. Hands reach toward a sky that refuses to sign receipts. At the water's edge, the Tiber and the Mediterranean become stages for stories. Old ferrymen swear they hear oars churning under the surface on breathless nights, the way villagers along the Danube once claimed to hear shields clashing below their boats. Temple attendants on the riverbank toss wreaths and whisper to Tiberinus to guide wandering hulls home. Women who cannot sleep step out to the balconies of creaking insulae and listen for horns that never blow. A boy insists he sees a long line of ghostly lights about 2 kilometres, about 1.25 miles offshore, torches marching where no ship should be, as if the convoy drills silently in the dark. Adults smile uneasily and pull him back inside. Egypt's gods enter the conversation because Egypt's harvest feeds the city. In Alexandria, sailors have always loved Isis Faria, protectress of the lighthouse, and they carve her name into talismans to keep their keels upright. In Rome, her cult thrives despite periodic scandals and bans. Sailors still leave little model boats at her shrines and promise better behaviour at sea, which is a promise like promising to be less wet in rain. Historians still argue whether the mid-1st century surge of Isis's worship in Italy reflects real maritime anxieties or simply fashion faith in a veil with starry embroidery. Whatever the cause, as hunger digs its thumb into Rome's ribs, the line outside her temple lengthens. The Nile's gods get blamed as well because the river's pulse writes the harvest. Some mutter that Happy is offended and has called his children home, that the ships will not cross because Egypt's own granaries sulk like cats who have had their ears pulled. Others, always happy to mix pantheons, bring Sobek into it, the crocodile god impatient swimming just below the surf with a mouthful of anchors. A vendor near the theatre of Pompey offers tiny green-glazed amulets shaped like crocodiles, swearing they make the sea return what it steals. No one asks how many loaves a charm can buy. Quirky tidbits sprout faster than fennel. A fishmonger on the Tiber swears the river spoke in bubbles, the night the fleet should have arrived, syllables rising like pearls, and that he answered, promising the first slice of every loaf if the boats would come in before dawn. A baker paints a pair of wide eyes on his oven door so it can watch the horizon, copying the eyes sailors paint on their prows to teach the ship to see. A young augur claims he has read the livers of the spring-sacrificed lambs delicately without gore, and found them marbled like storm clouds, the pattern that means delay. A street comedian offers the city a shortcut. If the gods ate less at the lectisternium, there would be more for the rest of us. The laugh is thin but precious. Light joke one earned barely. Because absence is elastic, it stretches to fit any theory. A philosopher drapes a cloak and argues that what people hear at night is simply the slap of small waves against the embankments, regular enough to sound like disciplined rowing. A poet refusing to be corrected by physics writes in 3 rushed stanzas that Neptune has borrowed the convoy to teach Rome humility, and will return it when he is praised in enough metre. A sailor refuses both, slaps a hand on a beam and says wood talks when it wants, and that is all. Omens multiply. A swarm of starlings spirals above Portus in a dark knot that tightens and loosens like a fist. Someone declares that the birds have formed the shape of a rudder, which means the fleet has no helm. A bolt of lightning rides a clear sky and stabs the mast of a moored coaster. The dock workers drink to Jupiter and go back to counting coils of rope. A statue of Ceres in a neighbourhood shrine beads with moisture-sweating stone though the morning is cool. The caretaker declares it a warning that grain is weeping in distant holds. Historians still debate whether such prodigy lists preserve real events, pious embroidery, or the way hunger makes everyone better at noticing patterns. Out on the Campanian shore, fishermen float palm-sized oil lamps on the water, so the sea will see that Rome is still awake. The lamps bob like little planets sputter and wink out as if swallowed. Like Joke 2, a boy tells his father the sea is just blowing out candles for a wish. The father says he hopes the wish includes a bakery. On calmer nights, experienced pilots swear the surface shivers with lines too straight to be wind, as if a long hull glides just below invisible except for its geometry. They stand very still, then look away because superstition prefers the corner of the eye. The state plays along because the state is made of people who want bread and quiet sleep. The Senate authorises a supplicatio and a vow that if the gods return the fleet, the city will give thanks with games and a grand procession. Priests of Ceres sweep her temple steps and burn salt cakes that crisp with a wholesome crackle. The Vestals feed the sacred flame like careful nannies. Across the river in a lesser shrine, where no senatorial foot bothers to tread, a small congregation sings to Tiberinus promising garlands at every full moon. Whether the gods like music as payment is not specified. A single mainstream detail links the pious with the practical. When prodigies worry, Rome magistrates sometimes throw straw effigies called the Argae into the river, as a ritual remembered more than understood ancient as the city's stones. This year, a few eager citizens improvise and toss loaves instead. Thin, stale, apologetic circles skimming the water like coins. Children clap when a crust floats longer than expected. Mothers cry when it sinks at once. The Tiber takes everything with the same calm. The farther the answer hides, the closer folklore stands. Some alleys insist that the fleet swims with Mero's river cousins of mermaids who fell in love with the gleam of amphorae and tugged the ships into palaces of pearl. Others prefer punishment. The gods bored with marble and flattery press a single finger to the sea and hold the keels in place. A few households revive an old habit and toss the first bite of every loaf to the threshold for the god of the door, because if a door can bless a home, perhaps a harbour gate can bless an entire coast. Light Joke 3 walks in late and yawns. A street oracle advertises a special 2 prophecies for the price of 1, and promises a refund if the fleet docks before sunset. His customers know a loophole when they hear one. They pay anyway, coins clinking like shy fish in a net, because sometimes buying a sentence is cheaper than buying hope. So the city hums its prayers and correctness at the sky, and the sea keeps its manners and its secrets. Skeptics call it noise over water. Believers call it message. Everyone calls it late. The supernatural explanation does not fill a single oven, but it does fill the silence, which might be all the silence wanted. The people breathe easier when their fear wears a face, even if the face is carved in foam. And if the fleet never comes, they will at least have told the story of why, with voices that sound like surf, a steady hush, a low insistence, and the feeling that something powerful listens and occasionally nods. The winds shift, and with them the fortunes of the Roman grain fleet. Out on the Mediterranean sails, billow ropes creak, and captains read the horizon with the same intensity you might reserve for scanning your phone battery during a long commute. Except here, one miscalculation can sink a ship rather than just leave you charger hunting. The convoy from Alexandria should be drawing nearer to Italy. Now its holds packed with Egyptian grain, but the sea has a way of demanding tolls from those who depend on it too much. Crews brace against sudden squalls, while centurions assigned to escort duties mutter about the gods favouring mischief. Onboard amphorae, full of grain, sway in their racks 1,000 breakfasts for 1,000 Roman mouths waiting far away. If one ship founders, Rome feels the loss in its stomach. If an entire fleet disappears, Rome begins to panic in ways even emperors cannot calm. The Mediterranean is not a lake, though. Roman writers sometimes describe it that way with smug pride. Its storms strike with a little warning, particularly in autumn when winds funnel through narrow straits. One mainstream fact worth noting: the Mediterranean sailing season usually shut down during the winter months precisely because conditions were too unpredictable. The grain fleet, however, had deadlines, and delays meant empty granaries in the capital. Captains often risked late departures or longer routes, gambling on clear skies. Sometimes the gamble paid off, and the fleet arrived to applause. Sometimes, as rumours suggest, the gamble cost everything. Historians still argue whether one particular disappearance occurred during such a seasonal gamble, whether the fleet pushed into storm-tossed waters when wiser men would have waited. The image is vivid black waves rising higher than a ship's mast sails torn to ribbons, and men clinging to ropes that slice their palms raw. A quirky tidbit appears in later chronicles, though dubious, it clings to the story like barnacles that a sea monster was spotted trailing the doomed convoy, its head the size of a merchant hull, its breath foul enough to make torches sputter. Whether this was simply sailors dramatising a storm or genuine belief in creatures beneath the waves the tale endured, it is easier after all to blame a monster than admit that Roman logistics sometimes outpaced Roman seamanship. Back in Rome, officials grow restless when dispatches fail to arrive. Markets that depend on the rhythmic flow of grain shipments tighten their belts literally and figuratively. Bread prices rise and bakers complain that flour deliveries are shrinking. The crowd notices immediately Roman citizens were promised subsidised bread, and when that bread thins, tempers flare. Emperors knew this pressure well. Even Augustus once bragged that keeping the people fed was the secret to keeping the city calm. Grain was politics in physical form more tangible than marble statues or golden triumphs. Without grain, even the most gilded empire felt hollow. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, administrators try to calculate where their fleet has gone. Couriers gallop with messages, ports buzz with contradictory rumours, and families of sailors demand answers. Did the ships run aground on the Libyan coast? Were they scattered into the Aegean by contrary winds? Or did pirates intercept them, seizing not only food, but also the prestige of striking Rome's belly? Historians still argue whether piracy could have claimed an entire fleet. Some suggest no band of raiders was strong enough, but others point to gaps in Roman patrols and note that a single bold strike could have scattered merchantmen far from safety. Picture the scene on a surviving ship, battered but afloat. The deck tilts under relentless waves, amphorae smash in the hold, and exhausted sailors pump water with wooden buckets that fill faster than they can be emptied. An officer shouts above the wind that Neptune demands more sacrifice, while another mutters that only bribes to the harbour gods will matter if they live to see shore again. Humour thin as it is bubbles even here. One story claims a sailor lashed to the mast shouted that at least the wine amphorae were safe so the afterlife would not be too dry. Whether anyone laughed is another matter. Silence returns with unnerving speed. No sails appear on the horizon near Sicily where they should. No messenger boat cuts through the waves to announce delays. The fleet simply fails to show as if swallowed whole by the sea. Rome's granaries weight their amphorae, dwindling their ledgers recording absence rather than abundance. The people whisper of curses of divine punishment, of imperial incompetence. The officials in charge scramble for explanations, writing memoranda that say everything except the truth. They have no idea what happened. The mystery lingers not just because of loss, but because of scale. A single ship can vanish without shaking confidence, but a fleet represents planning, wealth, and coordination. To lose one is carelessness. To lose dozens is catastrophe. And so the grain fleet's absence becomes the kind of riddle that resists tidy answers. Storm, sabotage, piracy, or curse all remain on the table, and all feed the uneasy silence that follows. Some villagers along the Mediterranean coast tell stories of wreckage washing ashore, planks carved with legionary marks, amphorae split, to reveal sodden grain, a sandal too large for a fisherman's foot. Whether these finds truly came from the lost fleet, or from some other misfortune hardly matters. Folklore attaches itself to every scrap, every buckle, every board. A fragment of wood becomes proof of disaster, and disaster becomes legend. Historians still argue whether such fragments prove anything, or whether they are merely the ordinary detritus of centuries of trade washing up in convenient patterns. The fleet's disappearance begins to echo through memory, attaching itself to other calamities. Later generations whisper that the sea took vengeance for Rome's arrogance, claiming the lifeblood of the empire to remind men that water cannot be ruled like land. The silence of the vanished ships becomes louder than any storm could be. The ninth act in this slow, unwinding mystery does not take place on the sea, or in the grain markets of Rome, but in the far quieter spaces where modern historians sharpen their quills, or more prosaically their pencils and spreadsheets. The disappearance of the Egyptian grain fleet has drifted for centuries in a fog of incomplete records, scattered inscriptions and half-remembered anecdotes. What makes it fascinating is not only the logistical calamity such a disappearance would cause, but the sheer multiplicity of explanations that have piled up around it, each one carrying its own evidence, its own gaps and its own emotional pull. Tonight, with the gentle patience of a listener drifting toward rest, we can follow these debates and see how the arguments themselves become part of the story. A mainstream fact anchors the conversation Rome depended heavily on Egypt, after Augustus annexed it in 30 BCE. By the 1st century of the empire, Alexandria had become the hub of grain shipments that kept the capital's urban poor from rioting. Some estimates claim that as much as 1/3 of the annual grain dole came from Egypt's fertile Nile Valley. That means that the sudden loss of even a single fleet would have been a political earthquake. This is not some fringe speculation, but a consensus point. The lifeline was real, and it was fragile. Yet when historians begin to trace the fate of one particularly notorious fleet, they discover the trail phrase alarmingly fast. A papyrus fragment speaks of delayed convoys. An inscription in Ostia hints at shortages. A later chronicle complains that bread prices rose beyond measure in a certain year. But none of these scraps provide the solid statement anyone would love to find. A fleet was lost on such and such a day with so many ships sunk. Instead, there are only shadows. Historians still argue whether this absence of clarity means the loss was exaggerated by later storytellers, or whether the imperial bureaucracy deliberately buried the embarrassment in neutral phrases. One camp believes in storms. The Mediterranean can be deceptively kind in summer, but when autumn gales begin to blow, fleets riding heavy with grain are vulnerable. Imagine a convoy of bulky freighters, their holds crammed with amphorae and sacks trying to round the rocky capes of southern Greece. A sudden squall could scatter them, and even 1 or 2 ships foundering might give rise to rumours of total disaster. Here the evidence points to patterns later Roman writers frequently note that grain prices spike after bad weather delays arrivals. The lost fleet might simply be shorthand for a season when Neptune took his tithe more aggressively than usual. Another camp leans toward piracy and human interference. The Mediterranean of the 1st and 2nd centuries is not entirely the peaceful Roman lake that old textbooks once suggested. Bands of raiders, sometimes supported by discontented provincial elites, do occasionally harass merchant shipping. One quirky tidbit, half humorous, half alarming, survives from a late inscription complaining that pirates once attacked a grain convoy using captured Roman fishing boats a bit like robbers trying to mug an armoured truck with bicycles. Absurd as it sounds, it underscores the fact that vulnerability always existed. Perhaps a particularly brazen raid, half covered up by embarrassed officials, grew in memory into the tale of a vanished fleet. There is also the sabotage hypothesis. Egypt itself was no stranger to unrest. From time to time, uprisings broke out among peasants, burdened by taxes, or soldiers discontent with governors. Could it be that an entire fleet was sabotaged before leaving port, set alight in the harbours of Alexandria, or redirected by corrupt commanders into black market sales? Historians still argue whether there is any genuine evidence for this, or whether it is simply the kind of sinister speculation humans always add when food goes missing. But the idea persists because power struggles in Egypt were often veiled, and grain was wealth on the hoof or rather on the keel. Some scholars turn instead to bureaucracy. Perhaps the fleet never disappeared at all, but was rerouted, its cargo requisitioned for a military campaign, its absence in Rome noted only by bakers and grumbling citizens. In this view, the mystery is less an act of nature or war than an accounting sleight of hand. Roman administrators famous for their love of ledgers could also be masters of euphemism. A missing shipment becomes a reallocation. A starvation scare becomes a temporary adjustment of rations. The debate then becomes not about waves or swords, but about language. Did the empire mask a logistical hiccup in phrases so bland they fooled even later readers? And then there is the romantic camp, the one that keeps the bedtime story alive. For them, the fleet truly vanished. Whether in fog storm or sabotage, it left no survivors, no wreckage, no clear aftermath. They point out that the most enduring mysteries often thrive because of silence. A solid record kills curiosity. A blank line invites it. They whisper that somewhere under the silt of the Mediterranean dozens of massive Roman freighters still rest intact, but drowned their amphorae sealed like time capsules. Quirky divers today sometimes swear they have glimpsed shadowy hulls on sonar, though nothing has been proven. Through all of this, the grain dole itself remains the lodestar. Romans were famously quick to riot when bread supplies faltered. Suetonius records emperors personally calming crowds with promises of new shipments. If a fleet truly vanished, the consequences would have been severe. Yet the empire did not collapse. This contradiction feeds the scholarly argument either the loss was smaller than legend claims, or Rome's logistical machine compensated more effectively than expected. Each side produces its own chain of probability, and the result is an endless ping-pong of debate. Humour inevitably seeps in because even dry academics need relief. One conference anecdote tells of a scholar who, after a long paper on grain fleets, quipped that if the ships had only carried wine instead, the Romans would have found them faster. Another suggested that the paperwork of missing ships probably outlived the ships themselves, since papyrus can last centuries if stored in a jar. The jokes are light, but they remind us that even experts wrestle with frustration when evidence refuses to behave. In the end, the story shows us not the certainty of what happened, but the vibrancy of the debate. The missing grain fleet has become less an event, and more a canvas onto which generations of historians project their anxieties, their pet theories, and their sense of how fragile empires can be. It is the silence itself, the lack of a definitive account, that fuels both scholarship and legend. For listeners drifting now towards sleep, that silence becomes a soft echo, an unfilled space where imagination finds its playground. Rome's records may be mute, but the whispers around them never stop, and in those whispers the vanished fleet sails forever on. The tale approaches its close not with a crash of certainty, but with the gentle swirl of possibilities circling like the eddies of the Mediterranean, where the Egyptian grain ships once plied their routes. The fleet from Alexandria that never arrived in Rome remains one of those mysteries that insists on being more than logistics, more than grain tallies, more than drowned timbers. It has become a mirror reflecting both the fragility of empire and the stubborn endurance of human curiosity. Tonight, as the narrative slows its stride, we linger with these echoes, letting the unresolved questions stretch out into the quiet. The mainstream fact that grounds this final section is simple yet enormous. Rome's survival hinged on regular food deliveries. Historians estimate that around 200,000 people in the capital depended on the grain dole in some periods. Remove one fleet, and you risk not only hunger, but social upheaval, even the stability of an emperor's throne. That this loss, whether real or exaggerated, was ever whispered about shows how acutely Romans felt the pulse of supply. A single gap in the chain could ripple across politics, markets, and the collective imagination. And then there are the quirky tales that refuse to die. Later folklore swears that a fleet overloaded with Egyptian amphorae was swallowed whole by a sudden maelstrom somewhere near Crete. Sailors told stories of ghostly masts glimpsed in moonlight rising from the waves, only to sink again before the eyes could fix upon them. Others imagined warehouses in Alexandria, where unscrupulous merchants hoarded the grain, selling it at wild prices, while Rome starved, a kind of ancient conspiracy theory that would not look out of place in today's rumour mills. These tidbits may not carry the weight of fact, but they remind us that whenever food and power intersect, gossip flows as freely as water. Historians still argue whether we should call this a true disappearance at all. Some dismiss the entire story as a later invention, a conflation of several smaller delays smoothed into one grand calamity. Others insist that the silence of the records is itself suspicious, a sign of deliberate erasure by administrators who preferred embarrassment buried under neutral phrases. The debates often circle back to a core puzzle. Why do humans remember absence so vividly? A battle, a monument, a law, all leave their marks. But an empty harbour, a bread line stretching too long, a missing fleet, these linger like shadows burned onto the mind. The sea as always keeps its secrets. Divers probing Mediterranean wrecks have pulled up amphorae still sealed with resin ships pinned to the seabed by centuries of silt. Yet none has carried a clear inscription naming the fated fleet. Perhaps the evidence is out there waiting under layers of mud. Or perhaps the fleet never perished so dramatically at all. The ambiguity is the point history sometimes prefers to tease rather than confirm, and in that teasing lies the charm of bedtime mysteries. Humour too still finds its place even in this twilight chapter. Picture a weary Roman official, Quill, poised muttering that if one more fleet goes missing, he will requisition camels to carry grain overland from Egypt to Italy, a ludicrous plan given deserts and mountains, but exactly the sort of joke men make when reality feels unsolvable. Or imagine a baker in Rome telling customers that their loaves are smaller because the gods went on a diet. Light sarcasm cushions heavy truths then as now. And so the fleet that never arrived becomes a metaphor. It speaks of empire stretched thin of rivers and seas that cannot always be mastered, of bureaucrats who smooth disasters into silence, and of people who fill silence with story. The grain that may or may not have rotted in Alexandrian warehouses, sunk in stormy channels, or been stolen by pirates still nourishes the imagination. That is the final gift of the mystery it feeds, not bellies, but minds centuries later. Now the story softens like the river easing into the sea, like the tide smoothing footprints on a shore. The vanished fleet drifts out of view, not in panic, not in despair, but in the hush that follows a long conversation. The listener can picture the Mediterranean in its gentlest mood, moonlight scattered across calm water, no storm, no hunger, only the steady breath of waves against a quiet coast. Let that calm expand. Each ship that once loomed heavy with grain now becomes a silhouette fading into mist, less vessel, more dream. The sailors who worried the officials, who argued the citizens, who fretted in breadlines, all their voices blur into the lull of night. The mystery no longer demands answers, it offers release. Some puzzles rest better when unsolved, like lullabies that do not explain but soothe. Breathing slows with the rhythm of the sea. Each inhale is a tide rising, each exhale a tide falling steady, patient, unhurried. The fleet does not need to arrive, nor the records to clarify. What matters is the gentle awareness that time absorbs even storms, even shortages, even empires. What felt urgent centuries ago has softened into a story, and what feels pressing tonight will one day feel the same. So let the Danube's whispers and the Mediterranean's hush blend into silence around you. Let the questions fold into the darkness, not lost but resting. Sleep waits like a safe harbour ready to receive you. Drift with it calmly, deeply into a night where mysteries cradle rather than disturb. Until next time, may your dreams be calm, your sleep be deep, and your night filled with quiet waters. Sweet dreams.